Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Leading Others Through Change, a three-phase model for success, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Diana Durek. Today's webinar will last around 1 hour. If you have any questions, you can always type them into the questions box. We will be answering questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or as a follow-up by email. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I will moderate today's webinar. Diana Durek is a leadership development specialist with an emphasis on emotional intelligence and personal change. She spent 11 years with a leading global psychological test publisher. There, she worked with clients as diverse as the U.S. Air Force, American Express, and Air Canada. She is currently pursuing a doctorate in corporate learning and development, a joint program between the Graduate School of Education and the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Diana, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the great introduction. I'm just going to jump right in because we have a lot to cover today. Sarah mentioned that the model that I will spend the bulk of the time on, it's a three-phase model. Well, that's true, but it happens to have 10 actual steps to it. So you're going to find that there are steps that I honestly, in 1 hour, can't say much about. But what I have done is I've included supplemental information for you to use back at work, and I'll point these out as we go, but I also think that they will be really quite obvious to you. So with that intro, I'd like to begin today's session by having you think about the following question, and more than think about it, having you answer the following question using the questions function. What comes to mind when you hear the word change? I mean, do you like it? Not like it? What do you think of it? What are your thoughts? So you're still typing, but I'm going to start going down the list because I can see the responses coming in very quickly. And I do apologize if I don't get to everybody's response. I can already see, I'm going to hazard a guess and say, about 100 responses. So let me just throw out some of what I see here and look for some patterns. Uncertainty, new, opportunity, change management, new, we had that already, learning experience, different, fear, opportunity for improvement, skeptical, fear again, growth, opportunities to learn and grow, depends on the change, very astute. New opportunities for business improvement, apprehensive, hesitation, I'm a change junkie, interesting. Change equals challenges, transition, constant, exciting, resistance, flexibility, excitement, inevitable. Always hard to cope as the expectations are difficult to assume. And one final one, what now? Well, that was a truly just a great list. And more importantly, it really well captures two main themes. So namely, one, very obviously, people don't like change. And as you'll see later, this is related in part to how our brains are wired. And so there are clear ways of handling this part of the equation. Now I'm going to suggest to you, however, that we also like change. We actually like change a lot. Now, for those of you, making faces at the computer screen, if not at me directly, if we didn't like change, we would never do things like get married, have children, take promotions, move houses, switch companies, switch roles for that matter, get degrees and certifications, many things that we all love to do. So I'm asking you to consider that change is a wonderful thing in our lives, but only when it's implemented using methods supported by research into what makes change successful. So having said this, a number of sources state that change fails much more often than it succeeds. So John Cotter, for example, in his book, A Sense of Urgency, he states that his experience demonstrates that change fails more than 70% of the time. Now, other authors have made similar claims that are more in the range of 40 to 80%. But regardless of this sort of broad numeric choice, it isn't the number that's important here. It's more important to explore why this occurs, right? So once again, I'd like to lean on your experience in this area. And again, you know the drill. Let's try to communicate using the questions function. From your experience, I'd like to hear what causes change efforts to fail. I'm actually scrolling down. That's how many answers I still had yet to read from the first question. So here we go. With respect to what causes them to fail, not being prepared, lack of change leadership, no buy-in, resistance. And by the way, for the person who asked how to respond to me, I am able to read your responses here. Resistance, top-down communication only, people being afraid, people don't have the right incentives, poor communication, very similar theme, not enough or appropriate communication. Again, the failure issue, again, the buy-in issue. I see communication, probably every third answer here. No planning, no follow-through on proper execution, again, buy-in. So clearly you're starting to see some themes here. Oh, here's a terrific new one, conflicting commitments, no backing from leadership, people not being committed. Unclear what's in it for me and possibly no true benefits. Individuals resistant to change. And again, I see a number of people talking about change, unclear goals, lack of vision. So clearly, there's some overlap here with what we were just asking about in terms of how you feel about change. So potentially some of these reasons go a long way to helping us also understand more fully why, when we don't like change, why that might be the case. So truly, this is an absolutely great list. And what I did, I took the liberty of summarizing just a few reasons, and there is absolutely nothing on this screen that you haven't already mentioned, and in fact, your list obviously was much more comprehensive. What I want to do, have you look at this list, and do you see any patterns? So what can we sort of deduce then about change efforts? Is there something that we can boil them down to? And again, if you'd like to contribute something, I'm scrolling down enough to get to the your next answers. So all the answers that I'm seeing pretty much, and there's less of them to this question, it seems that you're all honing in on this notion that it has to do with people and communication. And so I'm going to suggest that we have this common denominator that at the end of the day, the change has to be about individual people. But in response to your point about communication, change is going to have to lean very heavily on communication, and it's going to have to lean very heavily on an involvement and engagement of everyone involved. And I hope that summarizes adequately what you feel that was in your earlier list. Now, I don't have a slide for this next piece, but since as a group, my sense of you already from your so many answers is that you really have deep experience with this, I'd like to invite you to write down your thoughts on one last thing for this section. From your experience, what helps change efforts to succeed? change management, a good plan, buy-in, baby steps in communication, a clear plan, executive buy-in, people engagement, strong change leadership, a great culture, inclusion in the planning, people feeling that they are part of the change, repetition, clear goals, strategy, great change leader, commitment, explaining why it's happening, full sponsorship, speaking to the why, sufficient training and support, benefits me, crawl, walk, run. I love that. Clarity, two-way communication and vision, time to adjust, a realistic timeline. That is truly an absolutely wonderful, wonderful list. And if I go back to the presentation, again, what I've done is I've summarized some thoughts, and again, pretty much everything that I just read out, and I hadn't read all of your answers, but I read many of them, pretty much everything that you said, or there wasn't anything that you missed, in other words, is the point I'm getting at. So when you look at this list, let's think about what, if anything, does this list tell you about designing a successful change effort? And really, I see someone writing here, you must make a plan. The key thing that I would like to get across is, I mean, let's put it bluntly, these change initiatives, they're not easy. They're absolutely not easy. And they're going to require, as so many of you said, a clear plan and exceptional leadership. And so what I'm going to do with the remainder of our time together is introduce you to a process that will help you address these requirements. So the ACT model was designed by Elaine Beek. Now, many of you, of course, know Elaine personally or potentially through know her as the author of Training for Dummies, but she's also one of the most prolific authors truly in the field of training. So she created this model to help people remember all the steps involved. I mean, you know, one of you said crawl, walk, run. So all those, and I think one of you said baby steps or micro steps. So this was created to help you remember all of those small details, all the steps involved in implementing a successful change effort. Now, the ACT acronym stands for Activate the Change, Create a Plan, and Transition the Change. Now, I'd like to emphasize that while Elaine designed this process specifically for organizational change, you might find that some of the specific tools and tips that make up the 3 phases, they're going to be helpful to you in your day-to-day interactions. So not just when you're implementing larger scale change. So the first steps are in the Activate the Change phase. So as you can see on the slide, the first step is to clarify and align the vision and goals. Now, I saw from the registrations, there are a number of you on this call today who have attended my previous webinars, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the importance of vision as it applies to leading others and developing ourselves and other people. So let's try to build on that. Why do you think it's important to clarify and align the vision and goals of a change effort? And somebody also wanted me, Elaine Beek's last name is B-I-E-C-H. And her book is Training for Dummies, or at least, I mean, to my understanding, she has over 50 books related to training, but the one that I thought almost all of you would have heard of, at least the brand, is Training for Dummies. So getting back to the question with respect to why the vision is so important, we have people need to understand the why. It creates engagement among employees. The vision provides direction. It allows you to have one message. It creates buy-in. It gives clear direction, helps to maintain focus, As Covey says, thank you for mentioning Covey, begin with the end in mind. Helps people understand, no misinterpretation, makes change purposeful, to know where the changes go to, motivates action. People can see what's in it for me. So again, starting to see some of the same responses. It is not an exaggeration for me to say that there is absolutely nothing more important than communicating the vision. So why is this? Because a clear vision helps people to see the purpose and the advantages of the change effort, right? It gives people a reason for doing something. And a clear vision, it also helps people see the end state and to start to think and act in a way that supports the ultimate goal. And a compelling vision is also ultimately the very best way to market the change effort, which is also really critical in the process. So this next slide has some tactics for you that you can use to communicate vision. And I encourage you to take this worksheet back to your organization, and whether you use the tactics listed here or you create new ones, that's not the important part. The critical part of the exercise is for you to get very specific about how exactly you're going to implement each tactic in your organization. So now I'm moving on to the second step, and this is the determine readiness step. Dan Cohen, he's the author of the Heart of Change Field Guide. He believes that the 4 items on your screen should be considered in determining an organization's readiness. So first, the organizational temperature. So this step is as much a buy-in and communication step as an opportunity to obtain data. So when you ask people for input and they respond, they begin to feel like they have a part in the process. Next one, identify hurdles. Now these may be cultural, organizational, political barriers. Whatever they all need to be uncovered and dealt with early in the change process. Talking to people at all levels in the organization. Frontline supervisors and their direct reports in particular often understand the real problems and needs because they're closer to the customer and because their job requires them to see what's happening at the working level of the organization. And just with the point about organizational temperature, so talking to people, especially people so connected to the customer, is also going to contribute to people feeling very involved in the process. Lastly, expecting pushback. I mean, I think we uncovered earlier that it's human nature to resist change. So you want to begin to determine who and when and where and why, I mean, truly as early as you possibly can. So a realistic picture of what to expect helps you to plan ahead and be able to deal with the resistance that much more effectively. I have an example on this slide of how you can examine how ready you feel your organization is to take on a change effort. So the self-assessment that I pulled this from, it includes items under 3 general categories: culture, leadership, and communication. Now, the items from the communication category are listed on the slide. And what the assessment asks you to do is rate your organization on a scale of 1 to 4, from 1 being not at all and 4 being a very good description of your organization. Now, for those of you who may be quickly answering the questions right now, generally speaking, a score of at least 21 is satisfactory. But I would suggest that more importantly than the actual score, you want to go back and look at how you endorsed each item to see if there aren't some pieces of information there that you can use to improve on or leverage things that are coming very naturally to you. Now, I think just by looking at this, even though it's not the entire assessment, I think you can see how this type of assessment, I mean, it can really give you a strong sense of how ready your organization is and where you might be able to improve. And just to give you an idea about the other categories, in the leadership categories, there are questions like, leaders are willing to make difficult decisions. Another question is leaders are trustworthy. Under the culture questions, it includes things like employees are accountable for their work, employees are competent and knowledgeable. Excuse me. The third step in this phase is establish a sense of urgency. Now, for any of you who have read John Cotter's work, he is credited with introducing the concept of establishing urgency, and in fact, he feels so strongly that this is the most important element of a successful change effort that of his 8 steps to successful change implementation, as I said earlier, he wrote an entire book devoted just to this. So, as a general statement, we all become comfortable with the way that things are. Now, the problem is that comfort can lead to complacency, and complacency doesn't support change very well. So I know that we've all experienced complacency, not just in ourselves, but also in other people. And you might see it, it might come about for a lot of reasons. Ample resources, past best-in-class performance. Maybe you have a shoot the messenger type of culture in your organization. A lack of a current crisis, a lack of a competitor, inaccurate or inappropriate data being used. These are all culprits. These can all insulate leaders and the workforce from the reality. So what we want to do is to spark a sense of urgency and to really do everything we can to ensure that everyone understands how important the change is. So many of you brought that up in the earlier, at least written conversation that we were having together. So in order to do this, 2 things need to occur simultaneously. And not just simultaneously, but they often need to occur at many levels within the organization. So first, there needs to be a heightened energy and motivation about a need to change. And secondly, fear, anger, or complacency, if they have built up over time, these need to be reduced. So again, I'd like to hear from you, what are some strategies that you have? How do you go about heightening energy and motivation? And let's just do the first one first so that we can split these 2 lists out. So how would you go about, or how do you go about heightening energy and motivation about a need to change in your organization? So we're starting to see some answers come in. Emphasize the positive gains of the change. Start with the end in mind so people can see where they're going. Sell the idea. Lunch and learn sessions. Announcements. Being a believer that the change will bring better things. Maintain a positive attitude. We're seeing a lot about positive attitude, which will come out a little bit later in this presentation. All hands meetings, elicit feedback and opinions. Again, positive, employee engagement. Emphasis on what's in it for the organization and what's in it for me. Again, selling a lot. I'm seeing a lot of themes around small group discussions and all forms of getting people together and asking questions and sharing and kickoff campaigns and all kinds of things related to a lot of planning. I'd like to suggest that another thing that we can do is really around data. So for example, presenting data from outside sources like customer comments, customer satisfaction surveys, corporate comparison data, maybe even comments from the internet. Sharing competitors' data that compares to your organization. Sharing information about trends that are developing in the market. having employees speak with dissatisfied customers to find out from their whether their dissatisfaction, where it actually stems from, and seeing what actually needs to change. I also see, as I'm scrolling down further, someone talking about enlisting naysayers. Absolutely, very critical. So the point here is to really do as much as you can to expose what's really going on. That might even involve hiring external individuals to expose data and drive discussions about employee concerns. It might be a lot easier to do that when it's done by an external person than somebody internal to the organization. And another way to do so is to help managers to coach others around what it takes to actually implement change. So this is truly just a wonderful, wonderful list. I'd like to now move to ways that you think we can now reduce fear, anger, or complacency. And again, I'll read out as many of your responses as time permits, for sure. So things have started to come in. Perhaps creating a survey monkey to get staff to get things off their minds. Wonderful. Answer questions. Transparency, credibility, listen to concerns, individual meetings, so important. Be open to feedback, no surprise. Don't only say what's happening, but also what's changing, but what's also not changing. Communicate pros and cons. Encourage managers to engage concerned employees. Talk it up, small groups. Ice cream is always nice. Create forum for expression of concerns. Ensure early success. Be crystal clear about what is changing and why. These are just, again, your list your lists are going on and on and on. I think you're really onto this notion of, with the transparency that you mentioned and the credibility, you're really trying to show that you want to identify the root causes for attitudes. I mean, you're showing that you want to hear people's concerns. You might even, if you want to talk about concerns, you might even want to refer to recent engagement or employee satisfaction surveys, if they happen to be available, to see what needs to change. So there's all kinds of things that you can do to really open the lines of communication at all levels. And as so many of you mentioned, there's all kinds of different forums, all kinds of different meeting formats, if you will, to be able to do this. So this is a wonderful, wonderful list. And the takeaway here is for you to use some of these ideas to create a compelling business case or a dialogue that helps present data that leaders may have been avoiding. Introduce ideas that perhaps no one has considered, or simply tell a story of an impending future. And by the way, if you're looking for more information about this, these ideas initiated by Cotter and many others for establishing urgency, all of these ideas are very well explored in Cotter's books. So with that, I want to move to the fourth step in the Activate the Change process, or phase. I should stick to Elaine Beek's terminology. So the fourth step in the Activate the Change phase. Now, I would say that in a way, this is really an ongoing process. And the fact that so many of you have mentioned communication throughout this, throughout your answers, shows just how important it is and how it permeates everything. So it starts the day that you're first involved with a change effort, and it doesn't end until everything's been implemented. So clearly, you would agree from your responses, communication improves not only the quality of the decisions, but also the commitment to the effort. Now, An outcome of good communication is an increase in engagement. And I've listed the outcomes of increased engagement just as a reference point on the slide for you. Now remember that different groups and individuals need to be involved in different ways. Now some people are going to be at the center of the change and will need to take initiatives to sustain it. Other people, they're going to be on the periphery and they're only going to need to actually know what's going on without being directly involved per se. This slide, again for your reference, the communication plan that you're creating, it's going to need to incorporate both the giving and gathering of information, and you've got some options to consider on this slide. And this is my last slide in the Activate the Change phase. So this is a list of communication ideas. It has been compiled from some of the best change management gurus today. And what I encourage you to do with this list is take it back to your organizations and use it as a reminder of the many things that you may wish to implement to ensure good communication. I'm not saying you're going to do absolutely everything, although as I look at it, at least one of you has mentioned every single thing on this slide already. But the point being, keep it on hand and add your own so that you can keep track on exactly how you're doing with respect to this phase of the change initiative. And with that, I'm going to move to the second phase of the ACT model. So this is the create a plan phase, and it has 3 steps. This is where we're going to gather and analyze data. Now, this next slide has a list of things that collecting data is going to help you with. Now, I can't underscore this enough. At this point in the change effort, so now that we're in phase 2, your approaches all of them must be data-driven. And I think it's important here to point out the parallel between this organizational change process and how individual people go about successfully changing their behaviors. Now, for those of you who work with intentional change models, such as the one by Richard Boyatzis, you already know that the research indicates really very clearly that people must start with a vision if they are to be successful in making lasting changes in their lives. Now, once someone has a vision, the second step is to explore their strengths and weaknesses, but it must occur in this order. So sustainable change always starts with the positive because that's what gives us the energy and the motivation to go forward, to do the tough things that change requires. If you start with data, it's tough because you end up stressing yourself out, and the research suggests that you will likely fail. So my point is that whether it's individual change or, in this case, organizational change, the foundation is the same. So just as a memory jogger, if you will, it's always vision and future state that you create first, then you move to the data-driven approach. Then you look at the strengths and weaknesses and whatever else you're going to look at. Okay, back to the data collection. Now, I'm not going to talk about this next slide today, but I wanted you to have it for your reference material. So it's simply a list of ideas that you can consider when you're looking at data collection in your organization. And with that, I'm going to move to the next step in this phase. And this step is planning to manage resistance. Now, a little bit of background here. Evans and Schaefer, they are the authors of 10 Tasks of Change. And they state that resistance is a natural occurrence that is created by a widespread commitment to the current state. I love that definition. So if you look at it that way, we should expect resistance. Now, in her HBR blog, and the link is on the screen for you, Rosabeth Moss-Cantor discusses 10 of the most common reasons why people resist change. Since I'm encouraging you to read Cantor's short article at your convenience, I would instead like to make a general comment on the nature of resistance. So here's the deal. Change of any kind lights up an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And you can think of the prefrontal cortex like RAM in a computer. So it's fast and it's agile. It's able to hold multiple threads of logic at once so you can perform quick calculations. The problem is that the prefrontal cortex crashes easily because it uses a lot of fuel, which in this case is glucose or blood sugar. So the prefrontal cortex can deal comfortably with only a couple, well, I shouldn't say a couple, with only a few concepts before it bumps up against its very real limits. Now, it's this bump that generates a very palpable sense of discomfort and produces fatigue, and sometimes it even produces anger in us. So instead, the brain prefers to run off of what I'm going to call its hard drive. Now, in the brain, this hard drive is known as the basal ganglia. Now, the basal ganglia has a much larger storage capacity and requires much less fuel. So this is the part of the brain that stores the hardwired habits that we don't have to think about doing. And that includes many aspects of our jobs. So it's this interplay between the basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex which helps explain our resistance to change. So even though a new approach may be better, the existing approach is familiar, and therefore it's easier on the brain. Now, the other consequence of this brain wiring is that telling people to change, just, you need to change now, and just telling them how to do it, it doesn't work, because doing so activates the prefrontal cortex's connection to the amygdala. And some of you may remember the amygdala controls our fight or flight response. So the way to get around this brain wiring is to ask people questions in order to help them reach their own insights about the change. Now, I am sure that intuitively this makes sense to you. Think about how we bristle, and I say we because we all do it. Think about how we bristled the last time that someone told us what to do. I mean, really, honestly, when was the last time you changed because somebody told you to? And so while managing resistance appears here in the middle of the ACT process, the truth of the matter is that almost everything in a change management process is geared towards addressing the reality of resistance. The planning, the readiness review, the communication plan, and now the gathering of data are all required because they play a role in reducing resistance and putting others, or helping to put others, on their own path toward change. A little bit more on resistance just because it's so critical. I mean, it's natural, right? It will occur, and it is different for each individual, so it needs to be examined from all perspectives. Now, there's some questions on this slide for you that will help you when you go back into your organizations and try to identify the nature of the resistance. Now, to give you some background on where these questions came from, Rick Maurer is the author of Beyond the Wall of Resistance. And he believes that you can identify resistance at 3 levels and then treat it appropriately. So level 1 is based on things such as a lack of information. It includes a disagreement with the idea, a lack of exposure to ideas, or simple confusion. Level 2 is physiological and emotional, and it may come from fear of a perceived loss of power or control, loss of status or respect, feeling there is too much to do, or feeling incompetent. And level 3 may come from a personal history of mistrust, cultural, ethnic, or gender differences, or a clash of values. And finally, this is the last step in this phase. Involve and engage others really has to start with whether you have involved everyone who should be involved. So just to give you an idea, I mean, executives, of course, they can offer sponsorship, support, recognition. You've got management teams, informal leaders who can help connect you to the workforce, stakeholders who have a place in the process, naysayers. One of you was talking about naysayers in one of the earlier questions. So important because they can be queried about issues that someone else or the majority of people may have overlooked. And another great source of information can be focus groups. Then you want to go and consider the team level. So whether you're calling them guiding teams, improvement teams, transition teams, you know, I've heard change teams, it doesn't matter. Teams give people a way to be involved, and I would encourage you to leverage all of the great team processes that you were already using in your organizations. And finally, engage and motivate everyone who's involved. I mean, it stands to reason. Employees who are committed to the change will make the implementation and transition easier. So you're going to look to discuss how the change will help people. We talked about that earlier. A common theme, make sure everyone knows what's in it for them, providing valid reasons for the change, and linking back to individual jobs. I can't remember if we highlighted that one before. Reassuring employees that they will receive support and direction. And if you haven't heard this message yet, by constantly communicating. And this slide is just a sampling of the types of outcomes that you can expect when others are engaged and involved. And just like with some of the earlier lists, I'm encouraging you to take this back to your organization, add to it, you know, make it your own, but then use it as a way of keeping track on this part of the process. And with that, we move to the third and final phase of the ACT model. So I'm going to talk about how to transition the change, and this too has 3 steps. And the first is to design the implementation. So at this point, you're going to use all the information from the teams that we just talked about that have been involved in the process. And you're going to harness this information to design this implementation. Now, I know you know this, but let me state the obvious. You're not dealing with a single element here. You know, this is a system, and sometimes it's a very large system. So an integrated approach is required since a fundamental change will most likely change all aspects of the organization. There is not one plan, obviously, that's going to work for everyone, but a variation of an action plan is often a really great place to start, at least for your consideration. So in designing the implementation, the bullets that you see on this slide are the general buckets into which specific items of consideration for designing an implementation plan are going to fall. So these categories come from Elaine Beek's Thriving Through Change. So I'm going to take the first category as an example for you, review current information. So here, you're going to review the data that you've already gathered. So look at it and, you know, determine, does it tell the whole story? Do you maybe need to collect different types of data? Do people understand what has caused the need for change? As an example, leaders may have sold the solution effectively, convinced people of the mutually beneficial outcome, but maybe people actually needed to understand the problem better in the first place. So these are the kinds of questions that you were asking for each category here. And of course, when you're doing this in your organization, you want to be careful. The fact that I'm skipping the later points to make sure that I give you an overview of the entire process, I don't want in any way for you to think that you shouldn't work through all of these categories. So let me move to another tool that will help you immensely. I think by now you can see there's just so much to do, and potentially there are an awful lot of people involved. So you want to do something to handle the challenge of monitoring and tracking everything. So here is an example of a chart that will help you stay organized. And it does so by defining the roles that individuals need to perform in order to successfully work through the change. So first you've got the responsible. This is the person who owns the process or step within the process and needs to ensure that it works as planned. So generally, you're only going to have one R in a process, step, or activity unless two different individuals are assigned to different aspects of the process. So for example, one person may be responsible for the initiative and another for the process. Then we move to accountable. This is the person who has delegated the task of completing the activity or step or process. And this person supports the person who is responsible. So the accountable person approves the work provided by the person who is responsible. Consult. This person is a subject matter expert. They will have in-depth knowledge of the process, and all major decisions need to be signed off by this individual. So you need two-way communication here. And then lastly, the people who fall into the inform category, they could include more than one person. So these are the individuals who need to be informed, but they don't need to be consulted. So in this case, one-way communication is usually adequate. And what you're looking at here is an example of such a chart actually used in an organization. So there are 7 activities or tasks to be completed, and there are 4 individuals delegated to perform either one or more of the roles for implementing each task. Now again, your chart doesn't have to look like this, but you need to have something with this level of detail. Let me move on to the next step. John Cotter calls this step anchoring new approaches in the culture. As you see, Elaine Beek refers to it as institutionalize the changes. So many experts in the field of change assert that new approaches, they're fragile, and they're subject to regression until the changes have a stronghold on the organization's culture. So leaders need to make a conscious effort to demonstrate how the changes have improved corporate performance. Right? People's behavior may revert back, former processes may creep back in, and old sort of more familiar relationships, we talked about our interest in the familiar, those old familiar relationships may take over. So you will want to ensure that the change sticks, that it becomes a part of the way that you do business. John Cotter states that it isn't over until the change has roots. Well, I think it actually goes beyond roots. Who hasn't planted trees that had perfectly good roots? Without constant care, I mean for quite a period of time, the tree can still wither and die. This from someone who, can't seem to grow anything for whatever reason. So like a tree, you will want to keep the roots growing and healthy. And this means constant attention, like I said, for a good amount of time. I mean, in some instances, honestly, you could be monitoring this in some way, shape, or form for years. So I want to pause here for a second and hear your thoughts on this because it's so critical. I mean, all of these steps are critical, but at this point, when you've come so far, you actually want to make sure that this change actually has a lasting opportunity. So I'd like to hear from you. What can you do to ensure that the changes implemented become a lasting part of the culture? I see continual follow-ups, Q&A sessions beyond implementation, continuous improvement projects, constant reinforcement and audits, continue to walk the talk, ask for feedback, spot check, and again, continuous measurement. So we certainly see a theme here to be sure. Celebrate successes. Continue to emphasize the positive of the change. Communicate results. Don't accept regression to old processes, policies, and procedures. Weave into performance management processes. Wonderful. Move from one change that does not last to next flavor of the month. Very nice. Be prepared to fire. Absolutely. In 9 minutes left, and one more step to cover. I'm not going to delve too deeply into that, except to say that after we have, we are talking about compassion here. We are talking about working with people and using all of the steps that we've talked about, but there may be a point in time when either someone decides to leave or the organization will decide that it's not a great fit. So thank you for bringing that one up. Just a few more. Continued two-way feedback. Be honest. Reinforce the change through activities. Communication through many company mediums. Constituent behavior at all levels. And then hiring practices. Promotions should promote people who agree with the change. These are just so wonderful. And if I have to try to pull some themes, there's a lot of answers here around continuing to discuss the effort, removing the old ways so that people really have no choice, and continuing to discuss the benefits of the change. Certainly the communication plan has come up a lot. So this is truly just a wonderful, wonderful list. And the final thing I will say with respect to this, when it comes to monitoring, you may want to actually create an actual monitoring plan. So not just, not just have it in your head that you need to monitor, but actually institutionalize a plan and assign someone the responsibility for it to report on it very regularly. So wonderful, wonderful list. As an aside, the fact that you as a group are so knowledgeable about this tells me that oftentimes we know a lot about all the steps, but when we do it for ourselves, sometimes we rush through them. So it's not that you don't know a lot of this. Perhaps something in here is new, but for a lot of it, it's about sitting down and methodically going through each step. And let me move to the very last stage. So evaluation is one of the ACT steps that honestly sometimes gets skipped, more so than the others. And it's because now the initiative is over, so people are on to doing other things. And I am going to suggest to you that there is so much to be learned from this step and a lot to be gained by your organization. If you capture the lessons learned, think about it. You've already put in the time investment with the change. Now let's extract as much learning as possible from it, because it's going to help to steer your next change effort, right? Everything you learn is going to allow the organization to learn from mistakes and successes and create valuable information and lessons in preparation for the next initiative. So let me just go over the three things on the screen. The impact. So first we want to look at bottom line. Was the change effort a success? Now, evaluating the impact of the change, it's also an important step of closure, but you can also, in that act of closure, think about what you want to do with what you learned. So the more people that have been involved in the change effort, the greater the capacity for knowledge sharing and knowledge remembering for the next time. So please don't take a shortcut during this step. Identify whether the change intervention goals were met or not, or which part of them were. Process. Use a checklist. If you review the details of the process, you'll have a better understanding of the intervention itself. So think about it. How would you rate the process? Again, what lessons did the organization learn? What best practices will you repeat next time? Now, you want to get a group of people together for the evaluation, but also to identify those lessons learned that result from this evaluation. So that way you'll be able to carry what you learned forward, again, to the next change effort. And lastly, lessons learned apply to the leaders as well. Now, literally, we could do an entire hour on how leadership supports this entire process. Since we're not going to do that, at a minimum, you want to review all of the actions that were required, if you're the leader, for example, all of the actions that were required as you led the effort. Or if you're coaching others, you want to do the same with them. And so you want to rate leaders on how well they did and what things that they need to brush up on prior to the next change effort. And when I say you're doing this for others, I mean if you're in that sort of a coaching relationship. Otherwise, you're doing this for yourself. Because honestly, without this type of evaluation, potentially the organization is completely delighted with the change effort, but you as an individual leader, you really want to understand, you really want to recognize which of your actions contributed to the outcome of the initiative. And with that, I appreciate that I have not left much time for questions. I did see one very simple one that I'm going to answer way back when we were looking at that self-assessment that talked about organizational readiness. And one of you wanted to know if each of the questions are weighted equally, and the answer is yes. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Sarah. And
okay, perfect. All right, Diana, thank you so much. And if anybody would like to get in touch with Diana after the session, her contact information is on that screen right now. And unfortunately, we do not have that time for that live Q&A, but I am going to leave the line open for just a little bit, so some of those questions will filter in. And then we're going to take those questions, send them to Diana, and then we're going to send those back out about next week. So while we wait for some of those questions to come in, let me share a little bit about the program that is the foundation of today's session. And this is available as a self-study e-learning training program and a classroom training program. Leading Others Through Change is part of the Reproducible Training Library, a full suite of unlimited use content that's downloadable, customizable, and reproducible. It's easy to edit in both Microsoft Word and PowerPoint files. This training solution is an affordable, one-time purchase and yours to reproduce as needed. And for a limited time, we are also offering an exclusive 50% off. And if you would like a little bit more information about that, you can visit HRDQstore.com. And don't forget to register for our weekly webinar Wednesdays at HRDQ-U.com. So Diana, thank you so much again, and would you just like to add any final thoughts before I go ahead and close out this session for today?
Thank you. I just wanted to, sorry, I lost Sarah there. I just wanted to say that the fact that I didn't leave time for questions, I truly encourage everyone to send through questions. This program is so robust. It is so based on the cutting-edge knowledge of what is required for change. I felt that to do it diligence, I truly needed to at least mention every single step. And so that's why there has not been time for questions. And while I'm sorry that that occurred, I nonetheless am thrilled that you have been exposed to each of the 10 steps that are so important. And I absolutely welcome your questions and you know, in the written format, and I will be very happy to respond comprehensively. And thank you. I know that you have many uses for 1 hour in your day, so on behalf of HRDQ-U, I thank you so much for spending an hour with us.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And we do actually we have a lot of questions coming in. So if we did not get to answer those, you will receive an email response probably about mid to next week. So we appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative. Thanks.